Hi everyone, this is Isaac Steincamp from the Chess Summit Network, and a late happy Halloween to you guys. I actually, for today's video, I decided to record outside, which is maybe, I guess, a little bit of a ballsy move, but I'm actually outside of the Soldiers and Sailors Museum right now. There we are, which is where Silence of the Lambs was first shot for the first movie with Hannibal Lecter. So I thought about doing a video on the Halloween Gambit, which, if you don't know, is e4. So I create a new line. Whoops, I don't know what that was. E5, overwrite, knight f3, knight c6, and white looks like he's going for 4 knights, but the last second decides to switch into the Halloween Gambit where he decides to push forward his pawns, hoping to use some of his material advantage to really be able to create some sort of initiative. But when I kept on looking into the lines, obviously there's really nothing here for white, or else it'd be more common. White's just down a piece, but the idea is that the central thrust would be able to make some sort of progress. But I thought I'd go for something a little bit more exciting today, which was to talk about How to Swindle Part 2. For those of you guys who remember from my first video, How to Swindle, I had a game at the National High School Chess Championship where I was down 3 to 4 pawns at one point, but somehow miraculously managed to survive based on the concept of a mating net. And even though I was losing for most of that game, if not all of that game, I managed to win because of knowing, different methods of keeping the initiative. And I thought that this would be a great example to share. I don't believe I've shared this game yet. This is also from the National High School Chess Championship, but it's the year following. It's round 1. I'm actually, again, the favored seed, and I'm playing this guy who's about 1800 at the National High School Chess Championships, and things went rather smoothly for a symmetrical English, and I decided to try out a new structure I hadn't really messed around with that much, which was to play d4. I'm a lot more comfortable with these structures now, but everything's up to speed here. I chose to play e4 here, which is a theoretical mistake, and probably the first part of my undoing. The idea here was that by playing e4, I could control the center in the standard Marozzi bind kind of style, but it really just blocks in my g2 bishop. Queen to h4 is fine, followed by bishop to h6, but the idea is I can just play in the center, and I have a pretty stable game, and, white has a lot of compensation. e4 isn't a blunder, so to say, but it just makes my position a little bit less comfortable, and not being fully aware of these kinds of structures, I allowed my opponent to really get some sort of initiative. So he played a5, I played h3. I wanted to play bishop to e3, actually. So this move stopped knight to g4, but this move actually was the beginning of my undoing. Because after bishop to e6, my opponent puts pressure on the c4 pawn, but then if I play a move like b3, then this bishop can open up and attack nicely on this diagonal. So I kind of realized I was in trouble here. I played the move queen to d3, just to kind of get out of these kind of discovered attack threats of knight to d5 and knight to g4. So I played queen to d3, and then my opponent, I guess, really knew this opening, or had some sort of conceptual understanding that I had completely missed out on while studying it for this tournament. Here he attacks both the c4 pawn and the h3 pawn, and I'm doomed to lose one or the other. So in this position, I had to kind of make a decision. Which pawn do I want to lose, and how am I going to try to find revenues of play? So I decided to go for a standard Marozzi idea. I played knight to d5 with the idea of trading in the center, because even though I give up the h3 pawn, I can at least fight for the e-file and have some sort of compensation against this pawn on e7. Now, honestly, is this really anything? No, not really. My opponent played this move bishop to f5, which, it doesn't really do that much, because I can just counter with the move bishop to e4. My opponent shouldn't really take bishop takes g2, but what he should do is he should play the move h5. And I think that this move offers him the most amount of counterplay. So maybe rook to e8 or queen to d7 followed by h5. And I think black is actually close to winning at that point. And perhaps this is what differentiates someone who's an amateur from an expert, is that just understanding that white doesn't really have anything strong here. But by playing bishop to f5, I kind of realized my opponent was scared of the bishop trade. And I played bishop to e4, with the idea that if my opponent takes on e4, I can take back with the queen, and then put pressure on e7. And well, if he goes back to h3, well then, I'm doing fine. Maybe I can just develop my pieces. As long as b2 doesn't become a really big weakness, I can just put more pressure on e7. So my opponent played back bishop to d7, and I was looking for ways to kind of continue pushing my advantage, and here I decided I would go for the move bishop to g5, putting more pressure on e7, and allowing my opponent to have the option to take on b2. The idea was if bishop takes b2 were to happen, I would take on e7, attacking the f8 rook. If my opponent moves the rook, that's fine. In some lines, I even had ways where I could sack the exchange and then use the dark square weaknesses on my opponent's king side. I kind of realized that I'm worse here, but my opponent's already played passively enough that I can afford to sacrifice material to try to get some sort of initiative. If I can win both the e7 and the d6 pawns, I think the exchange sacrifice is justified, just on the fact that I already have some pawns that are close to passed at this point. So my opponent played rook to e8, and I really wanted to be able to generate more counterplay while also creating adequate defenses. So I just played the move rook to e2, so my rook could slide over while protecting the b2 pawn, and I'm not really losing time. And when you put a lot of pressure on your opponent positionally, they generally tend to make mistakes, especially at the lower levels. And here, I think was my opponent's first mistake. He played the move e6, which at first seems like a really nice idea because it really breaks up the center, and there's no more pressure left on the e-file. But black actually creates a nice target for white, which is this d6 pawn. So not only can I play on this long diagonal in some lines, I can also play for d6 and try to generate more counterplay. So this was, even though the computer would say that my opponent is winning, the initiative is already shifting more over to white's favor. So I just took bishop takes, and I played the move rook to c1 just to solidify my pawn structure. There's no rush here to really attack any of these weaknesses. If I were to play queen takes d6 here, I think I like my opponent actually after a move like queen takes c4, putting pressure on the rook, threatening to move the bishop to attack my light squared bishop. The position was kind of unpleasant, so this move made the most sense to me. My opponent played bishop to f5, and now the position is objectively equal after these trades, doubling up my opponent's pawn. So my opponent's extra pawn isn't really that substantial, but if we go back to this position, it's really hard to go ahead and recommend moves for black. He has to deal with this d6 pawn, the queen's pinned down to b7. I can kind of understand why my opponent made the decision he made, but he really should have tried to hold on. A move like bishop to e5 doesn't really work because of the move f4, and a move like f6 just allows me to play bishop to f4 and put more pressure on d6. So I wasn't really sure what to do, but I really was happy to see my opponent play bishop to f5, kind of just trading in his material advantage for just a more stable position. So we went for trades on f5. I played rook on c to e1 with the idea of just controlling the e-file. And my opponent played rook to e4, which was a move that I was expecting, but at the same time created a lot of weaknesses for my opponent because he has a really weak back rank. And in these kinds of positions, just like the game in How to Swindle Part 1, you want to look for mating nests and try to be able to exploit your opponent's weaknesses. Even though my opponent threatens the c4 pawn, he can't play rook takes c4 right now because of the threat of rook to e8 check, followed by attacking the pinned bishop on f8 with a move like bishop to h6 or bishop to e7. So I went ahead and played the move f3, and my opponent made a kind of dubious move here. He played check, which goes under that idea of Patzer play a check, Patzer see a check, Patzer play a check, and I didn't really like this move because now it's going to be harder for him to protect this d6 pawn from d4 as the game followed. So king to g2. My opponent really has to trade rooks here. And now, with the threat of bishop to f4 coming, it's going to be hard for my opponent to practically defend this d6 pawn. If he plays bishop to e5, I can play f4 and then reroute my bishop to e7, attacking d6. And I already was starting to think that I have really good drawing chances, and maybe I can go ahead and start thinking about playing for the win. My opponent made a positional mistake here. He played the move f6, and after bishop to f4, bishop to c5, my opponent's bishop is already starting to run into the dilemma that some of the key pawns in his structure are on the same color as his bishop, whereas most of my pawns are on light squares, and it's going to be harder for my opponent to attack. In this position, I wasn't really crazy about the move bishop to e5, because I can move the bishop and play f4, kind of trapping in the bishop. So like bishop to e5, bishop to e3, and then I can play this move f4, and I'm not really sure how my opponent's going to get out of this bishop trap. So if you just put this on the board for a second, the key is not to take, but rather put the bishop on e3, play f4, and my opponent's bishop is running out of squares. Same dilemma as my opponent having pawns on the same color of his bishop. So bishop to c5 was more or less forced. And then here I played the move rook to e7. It's important that when you're materially down but in an endgame, you have active pieces, because sometimes material alone doesn't justify who wins or loses in an endgame. This move really provoked the move b6, because if rook to b8, my opponent also runs into the problem that d6 is pinned now to the rook because of this f4 bishop, and a move like rook to c7 can be really nasty. So after rook to b8, I can play rook to c7, attacking the c5 bishop, attacking the d6 pawn, and I'm not so sure if my opponent can really get out of this. So I went for the move b6, and now I had to really think, how do I go about exploiting my opponent's weaknesses? And so here I decided to go for the move bishop to h6, and I thought that this generated the most amount of play for white. Black's king is trapped, and obviously in the endgame you want to use your pieces to your advantage. And I thought that this move did a really good job of kind of containing my opponent's king, using that same idea from How to Swindle Part 1, where my opponent really only had the squares between g8 and h8 because of my pawn on h6, and my light squared bishop was able to control the g8 square. Now it's kind of like the inverse of that idea, with the opposite colored bishops. So the dark squares are under my control. I have the 7th rank under my control. And already I think the computer says that this position was equal, and even though the computer's assessment was like 0.00, I mean, I think that, if you're a pure computer, you're a pure computer favorite guy, you're going to say, okay, this position is drawn. But I think by saying that, you miss a lot of the beauty in chess, which is sometimes 0.00 is winning. Because psychologically, there's a lot for black to go through. He went from, let's see, in this position right here, being up a pawn and looking like everything was going to be favorable against a higher rated player, to this position right here, and now my opponent's really running out of ideas. So here my opponent decided he better go ahead and bring in his pieces into the game. I decided to throw in a quick kind of repeat, but the idea here was by putting the rook on c7, I solidify my pawn structure. My rook's on a little bit of a better square, because in this position, maybe my opponent has this idea of d5, and I think if my opponent can trade this d-pawn for the c-pawn and open the d-file, my opponent has some counterplay. So if I play rook to g7, my opponent can't play king to f8, obviously, because rook takes h7 check. He's forced to go into the corner, and then when I play the move rook to c7, this idea of d5, it's in the air, but it's not as effective, because now this bishop doesn't have the discovered attack on my rook, and I have the move bishop to g7 followed by taking on f6. So my opponent decided it was his best interest to take the e-file, which I agree. I played the move king to h3, so there'd be no checks. My opponent played king to g8. I threw in a quick check, and now I put my rook on f7 with the idea of attacking these f-pawns. Now, when my opponent plays bishop to e3, it's important to not play rook takes f6, because I think in that position, white really gets in a lot of trouble, because after this trade, it looks like white's heading into an endgame where it's equal pawns, but black has weaker structure. But after a move like rook to e2, I really have to start questioning, can I survive? Because after a move like rook takes d6, rook takes b2, the c-pawn isn't really a threat for black, and my a2 pawn's really weak. Meanwhile, black can go ahead and start thinking about pushing the b-pawn, with the same idea of maybe after like a4, rook to b3, picking up f3. I think I'm losing here, actually. So it is important to not go for this idea. And after bishop to e3, if I take his bishop, I'm running into some practical problems, which is the same fact that black's rook is actually more active. If I take this time to take this pawn on f6, well, this pawn wasn't really doing anything, and now black can take on f3 with a pawn that was actually, potentially helping me push on the king side. And after a move like rook takes d6, rook to f2, yeah, I have rook takes b6, but practically I run into some problems where I'm not sure if I can win anymore. So in this position, I made the only move that I thought would let me play for a win while maintaining positional equality, which was this move f4. And the idea is that now black's bishop has some problems, and that it doesn't really have that many more squares to go to. And even though I block in my bishop, I still have mating potential. This rook can never leave the 8th rank, while my rook is pretty vicious on the 7th. So my opponent played bishop to d4, provoking me to play b3. So now all my pawns on the queen side are on light squares. My opponent can't really target them, and now most of my opponent's pawns are on dark squares. My opponent played the move king g8. I threw in this check, and I played rook to d7 to force my opponent's bishop to c5. And here I had to think, how do I want to exploit my opponent's kind of weaknesses? And in reality, my opponent can still draw this game, but I have to be aggressive. I have to create squares for my king. And I played the move g4. And the idea here was that if my opponent throws in this check, well, I'm still playing for an initiative, because after h4 I can push the g pawn, I can take on f5. Personally, I'd probably play g5, because after a move like g takes f5, my king's going to have a hard time getting in the position. So I'd probably play g5. This check doesn't really work. Also, not to mention, let's go back to that, my opponent also has to deal with the fact that a move like rook d8 is immediately checkmate. So my opponent panicked here and actually made the game-losing move, f takes g4. Up until this position, at a grandmaster level, the game would be drawn, but now I can use the fact that my opponent doesn't have a light-squared bishop. So king takes g4, rook to g8, king to f5. My opponent played this move, rook to g6, and I really like this move that I played next. And, honestly, I probably showed this game to show off this move, which was this idea of king to e6, which I really liked. The idea is obviously if rook takes h6, I have an unstoppable checkmate with this idea of rook d8, so maybe like d5, rook d8, bishop to f8. And obviously here we have checkmate. So this isn't really possible. So my opponent can't really do anything about that. He can play the move rook to g8, which is fine, but again I'll play king to f7. And let's say my opponent moves his bishop because he doesn't have a better move. Well, then here comes rook d8. So I need rook takes g8 checkmate. My opponent better take. But then hello, bishop g7 is checkmate. So checkmate's actually unstoppable in this position unless my opponent really wants to give me material. f5 check doesn't really help my opponent because again my opponent doesn't have a light squared bishop to stop me from infiltrating in my opponent's king side. So I really thought this game was instructive because even though I started a pawn down, I kind of used just positional ideas to get back in the game by applying pressure. And sometimes in chess, when you're down a material, it's important to look for structural weaknesses. So even though it's really easy to panic after going down a pawn, and maybe my opponent could have h5 threats, you have to be practical. You have to say, okay, I have to look for what my opponent can do that can really influence the structure of my game. And honestly, here it's the pawn on e7. And my opponent, I guess not really being familiar with these Morozzi's ideas, really kind of bunkered down and just tried to play defense. And, already here in this position, I was feeling pretty confident that I could at least hold out for a draw. When my opponent played e6, I think practically the game was over because I had more targets than my opponent. And even if the game was drawn, this is a much harder position for my opponent to defend than it is for me to attack. And, my opponent missed some chances, but in all honesty, the game was lost positionally here after I was able to control the e-file and really dominate the position. So this was how to swindle part 2. Remember, just look for positional flaws in your opponent's position. In this game, it was the same case. Controlling the 7th rank, activating your king, using your bishop to kind of make a mating net for your opponent, and really trying to get out there. And, I was really happy to see that I could use the same idea in the same tournament 1 year later, but at a much higher level. So this is Isaac Steincamp signing off from the Chess Summit Network. Wishing you a happy Halloween and a safe weekend.